Kia ora koutou katoa. I am Satyamitra Ashok, Executive Director at Social Enterprise Auckland, and it is my pleasure to be here today in the midst of a very extraordinary time. Social Enterprise Auckland is a collaborative project that builds momentum and connects social enterprises together, illuminates their stories, and amplifies investment opportunities. We are building a culture where all businesses consider creating social benefit. In this new initiative, we are creating a series of discussions and conversations with people in different parts of the social enterprise ecosystem to tap their expertise, hear their stories, and look to learn from them. These discussions are not designed to be in-depth ones. They are meant to be relatively short conversations that leave the maximum impact. Today, we're joined by Jackson Rowland from Akina's Invest arm, and Dr. Jane Horan, who is an economic anthropologist here in Auckland. And they will be sharing some insight on legal structures for social enterprises in New Zealand, drawing from their report, which was published in 2019. My pleasure to welcome you both to the series, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Jastia. Kia ora everyone, my name is Jackson from Akina. I'm just going to briefly explain the genesis, I guess, for the structuring for impact report that Jane and I both spent a lot of our lives on. And then I'll hand it over to Jane, who can introduce herself and share some of the findings of that report. So within our role at Akina of really trying to support social enterprises and in particular communicate with government about that. We had a number of conversations with government around social enterprise legal structures because we consistently heard from the sector, from the social enterprise sector, that there was a problem with the legal structures. It wasn't enabling social enterprises to the extent it was traditional business. So because of that, we had conversations with government about that, and we received a letter from Minister Parker back in 2018 saying thank you for the conversations and the information you provided, but the government would like to see more information, more examples of the disadvantages that social enterprises face with the existing legal structures. So based on that, we commissioned a piece of research that Jane led to really understand that problem better. How are social enterprises disadvantaged by the existing legal structures? So with that, I might hand over to Jane to share more about the outcomes of that process, and I can update with what's happened since the report afterwards.
Kia ora. Thanks, Jackson. Okay, so I'm Jane Horan. I'm an economic anthropologist, which just means that I look at economic systems from a much broader brief than a standard economist does. So just diving straight into the research, just as per Jackson's piece about how it was commissioned, we applied for funding from the Law Foundation and got, which was supported the research, which was great. So from a methodological point of view, it was quite a tricky process to put together. But so the research was really about how figuring out and recording and analysing how social enterprises encounter and work around or settle for or effectively curtailed by the current legal structures that are available to the social enterprises. So we set about speaking to as many within the social enterprise sort of ecosystem as we could, so that a cross section of people, so that we could get a sense of how this was playing out. So we spoke to 27 different individuals from across 20 interviews. 16 of those individuals were from 20 different social enterprise organisations that ran a social enterprise or a parent organisation that had one or more social enterprise in the mix. We spoke to 3 individuals from straight charities, 1 individual from an accountancy firm that deals pretty much exclusively with social enterprises and charities. We spoke with an official from Charity Services, 2 people from the IRD to speak about social enterprise from the tax perspective, 2 individuals from a commercial trading bank, 1 from a philanthropic funding organisation, and 1 from an impact investing organisation. So these interviews took place. There was at least, I was across all the interviews, and there was at least 1 lawyer in the room. Some lawyers, so Jackson's a lawyer, he was there for some of them. There was also lawyers from either Chapman Tripp or Russell McVeigh, or from Parry Field in Christchurch. So we had, because we needed an expert on the Companies Act basically, and legal structure per se, and in the interviews as well, which was very helpful. So that was the sort of, and the interviews lasted for between an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours. And we then transcribed all the interviews and analysed them accordingly, and then we wrote our report based on that. So let's start in on the presentation. So basically, we came up with 3 main themes that the social enterprises that we spoke with were being challenged by. And of the 20 organisations that we spoke with, only all of them had some issue with their legal structure, but except for one organisation who was neutral about their legal structure. So all of them were finding it difficult, or there were hurdles in the way in some way or another, sometimes much greater than others, but it depended on the context, but only one organisation was neutral, and there was specific reasons for that. So the 3 themes that we saw emerging were that, as per this diagram, social enterprises struggled to be recognised or trusted within the market. They, with the current legal structures they've got, they couldn't protect their mission very well, which meant ultimately that they all struggled in one way or another to access capital, which effectively limited their capacity to pursue a double or triple bottom line. So looking after, not only making money to be sustainable, but also looking after the planet and looking after people. So let's look at those. So businesses who prioritise impact and profit struggle to be trusted. So in New Zealand, there's a prevailing thinking that businesses exist to make money and charities exist to do good. So there's this binary, and effectively a split between entities that do business and entities that are meant to do good in the world. The businesses who aim to deliver profit and impact are often challenged in the public domain because they're an aberration, really. So if you're trying to do good and make money, then you're basically outside the square. You're a square peg in a round hole, so to speak. And the same goes for charities. Charities that employ a trading model are kind of frowned upon. They're not seen as proper charities, in other words. So this is all in part because of what the relationship is between charity and for-profit business, and how impact enterprise relates to these. Because neutral legal structures are not neutral. They reflect bigger structures within society. So if you Google the relationship between for-profit business, charity and impact enterprise, you tend to get this sort of top diagram with this sort of linear diagram. We've got business at one end, charity at the other, and social enterprises actually supposedly comes in between. But as we moved through the interviews, we realized that actually doesn't really represent the relationship between for-profit business and charities, particularly in relationship to the legal structures we've got, because in fact, the relationship between charity and for-profit business is more like this bottom diagram. So in fact, charity is part of this bigger structure that we've got called capitalism. So you've got a very specific segment of this of the business of the economy that's dedicated specifically to doing good, and the legal structures actually hermetically seal that particular part of the economy in very strict ways. Hence the very strict rules around what it takes to be a charity. So social enterprise doesn't really fit within that mix. Now, not all social enterprises are the same, and some of them can be defined by that sort of linear scheme, but there are other social enterprises, and in particular the ones that we spoke to through the duration of our research, who actually constitute something different, who are, because of their complete and utter mandate to look after people and the planet as well as make money, they really exist in some ways outside of the capitalist system of economy and into what we're calling the human economy. So in a human economy, you've got different types of capital are equal. So in particular, human capital and environmental capital, as this is the terminology of the Living Standards Framework too, all sit alongside financial capital, whereas in the capitalist economy, the only capital that's really valid is financial capital. So this relationship between social enterprise and charities and for-profit business is an issue if you've got a legal system that replicates this very specific binary between charity, i.e. doing good, and for-profit business, i.e. making money. So it becomes problematic when you're trying to fit the square peg in a round hole. So, which is what social enterprises are trying to do when they're using the current options for legal structure, which are really the LLC, the limited liability company, with a set of charitable structures. So moving on to the other point, businesses who prioritize impact and profit struggle to protect their mission. And maybe Jackson, you can speak to the sort of the legal implications of how to enshrine your mission within within an LLC.
Yeah, well, this has been an interesting one that we'll come to maybe more in this towards the end of this presentation. But the really strong message we were hearing from social enterprises is that they struggle to protect their mission within a charitable structure. There is mission lock is inherent within that, but within the company structure, there's no explicit recognition or allowance of mission lock. I say explicit is important there because there's also no prohibition of it. It's just silent. The Companies Act is silent on mission lock. So I'll talk more to that later on. But what that silence has led to is a perception that mission lock is not possible. And consequently, some very complicated workarounds for organizations who may be looking to raise capital, for example, but want to protect their mission in the process. So there's been, we spoke to social enterprises who had spent upwards of $20,000 on legal structuring to protect their mission when their ownership is broadening through investment. So it becomes quite a complicated process to protect that mission and really lock in what is so important to the founders, and reflecting that to the consumers, to potential investors, etc., that this mission is 100% important to you and you don't intend it to change.
And when you live in a world where it's commonly understood that companies that do good are charities and companies that make money are for-profit businesses, to mix that up is problematic because there's a distrust from consumers, from banks, so hence the need to be able to protect your mission, to be able to say, this is what we're saying we do this, and we really do this, and to have that sort of officially recognized in some way is not possible through the current legal structure because there's a silence around mission law. So the convoluted structures and it's reported in the report, and there's a set of case studies at the end of the report that outline how a number of companies have gone about creating these very, very creative but expensive systems of trying to enshrine mission. So businesses so ultimately it comes back to capital, really. So most of the social enterprises that we spoke with had trouble accessing capital. And again, the case studies sort of outline some of the really elaborate ways that organizations had to sort of work with bankers in particular and impact investors to convince them that A, what they were doing was bona fide, and that B, that they were sustainable in the scheme of things. So it's difficult to do this. And even when we spoke to the banks, the banks and the impact investor and there's still this perception, this mistrust of what social enterprises really are. So there's confusion, non-recognition from investors in the market, mistrust with investors in the market, perceived inability to protect mission. So all of these things result in complexity of mission lock, wraparounds, which confuse investors, philanthropic capital generally not available to LLCs, even if impact outcomes align with funders. There was one organisation that went for B Corp certification. They weren't, they were charitable because they had to be charitable in order to do their work within the broader New Zealand society, but they couldn't become a B Corp because they weren't registered legally as a for-profit business. So there's all these sort of kind of ridiculous realities kind of opposed by the process of this square peg trying to fit into a round hole. But so the inability to access capital results in organisations struggling to scale both the business and impact, in some instances failing. So businesses who prioritise impact and profit struggle to deliver social, environmental, economic outcomes. So the ability to scale is significantly curtailed. Innovation is going into trying to create bespoke legal structures rather than innovation within the market. So entrepreneurship is sort of diverted, social entrepreneurship is diverted into other processes rather having a bespoke legal structure, and what that bespoke legal structure needs to be is well, we're still working on that, but it's but if we had something, we could sort of scale these organizations. So yeah, that's where we're at. So Jackson, maybe you speak to the solutions.
Yeah, I can speak to this piece. I would just add to the previous slide. You know, it feels like it's a really all the conditions required for this to get traction are really starting to coalesce in New Zealand. We have a wellbeing framework now. You know, B Corps are becoming really common. We're hearing louder and louder that consumers are demanding, you know, businesses have a broader purpose than just profit. So we think things are really going in the right direction for this, which is one of the reasons we've been having conversations with MB in particular, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, off the back of this report to really understand what could things look like. So I guess before I speak to the solutions, what has happened since we finished this report is we've been having a number of conversations with various officials within government, primarily within MB and also DIA, the Department of Internal Affairs, to really understand how this aligns with existing priorities and how we can collectively work together to come up with solutions. The report and the brief for the report was really specifically focused on the problem side of things, really trying to understand what is the problem social enterprises are facing with their legal structure. So we didn't really delve into the solutions other than giving some high level direction around what it could look like and how those problems could be solved. So through our consequent conversations with government, we've been, the focus of that since finishing the report has really been to help them understand the problem. I think Jane and I would both admit that we sometimes speak in a different language to government. And so we've been working really closely with MB and with a lot of their support to really help translate things into a language that better works for government, so they can really understand the problems that we understood. Once we got to that point, we then jumped into the solution phase. So we're really pleased to hold a workshop with a number of officials within MB, DIA. There was a representative from Russell McVeigh there, and also some Akina staff, to collectively try and come up with some solutions. The reason for solutions is that for government to assess any changes based on the problems that we've identified, they need to run an analysis to understand the implications of those changes, the benefits of those changes, etc. And they like to have some options there to run through that analysis. So together we had a workshop to really try and come up with what solutions could be to overcome these problems that the report identified, and Jane has just spoken through. Some of the three that I've got on the slide here, I'll summarize really briefly. So what the first one, an impact company is effectively, you know, there's a number of ways to turn this into reality, but what it's looking for in the principle is basically keeping the limited liability company. Most people we spoke to agreed that was a really strong, flexible, simple entity, but how can we add some sort of impact label on there? So, you know, for example, if a company puts in their constitution their mission, they agree that that's locked in, and they agree to report on that, for example, report on their performance to that mission, then maybe they get this impact label. So it becomes an impact company, an impact limited liability company, for example, rather than just a straight traditional limited liability company. That becomes a really strong signal to consumers, to investors, procurers, etc., that this organization has a purpose beyond just profit. And further, they're reporting on that annually because that would be required within the legislation. So that one would require legislative change to realize this kind of impact, to add this impact label to the existing legal structure. So that was one option that we think could be a really good solution to the problems that we've identified. The second, I guess, acknowledges that legislative change is difficult. Government is really busy with lots of really important and competing priorities. So for us to get some traction and to try and overcome those problems, we wanted to start looking at maybe less extensive legislative reform. For example, an impact status. a comparison to demonstrate this is EnviroMark, you know, a status that is used to demonstrate the environmental performance of certain businesses. What if we could create something similar, but instead demonstrates the impact performance of certain organizations? So it would entail creating an organization to manage and maintain this mark, and create a process for organizations to follow to apply for this mark. But once they have followed, this body outside of government accredits them with the mark. And again, that mark is used for similar purposes, to demonstrate to consumers, to investors, to procurers, that this organization does pursue things beyond just profit, and that is okay, and that is normal, that can be trusted, that can be recognized. There would be a mission lock probably as part of the requirements, and it would hopefully enable greater access to capital. So we think that's an option too. And finally, again, with this lens of how do we best enable, provide really different options for government to assess, we looked at an impact education campaign. An important observation here from officials within MB is that the limited liability, as I touched on earlier, limited liability company doesn't exclude emission lock. It doesn't explicitly contemplate it, but nor does it say one is not allowed. And it is really flexible, so that it is possible for organizations, for example, to put in their constitution, our mission is X, and it will take a vote of 99%, 100% of shareholders if that is going to be changed. So there are ways to put a mission lock of sorts within the existing limited liability company. So what if instead of any sort of body or legislative change, etc., all we do is create an education campaign to really grow the awareness that that is possible? Because most people we spoke to, even some professional service providers, weren't aware that there was as simple a workaround as that. There is absolutely nuances to it, you know, how do we really work on that trust and recognition aspect as well, but it's a really interesting option to consider. And that's something that Akina, we have already created one resource to clarify how organizations can protect their mission within their status quo, and we're working with business.gov to have that published on the business.gov website. But also thinking beyond that, and how can we really try and ramp up the awareness of the ability to protect mission within the existing legal structures. I think that's the solutions in a nutshell, I think. And so I guess just speaking briefly to next steps, it was all going well, as I'm sure a lot of our lives and businesses were. You know, that workshop, which was only a couple of months ago, was a really promising step with government. And then we've had this pandemic, which has been horrible for a lot of reasons, and really been huge upheaval for a lot of you watching this, I'm sure, including government. So what's happened is the officials that we've been working with have been instructed to pause all existing work, and instead they've been diverted into some other really important and timely work to enable and aid New Zealand's recovery to the COVID pandemic. So we completely understand that and are supportive of that. It hasn't been that this has stopped completely. There's still, you know, I think interest from officials to continue this conversation, but right now there's just no breathing space within government. We also acknowledge that, you know, sometime soon, once COVID settles down, there'll be an election, and that's another significant upheaval within government. So I think from Akina's perspective, the next time we'll be looking at the tentative plan is we'll look to start pushing this a bit further, probably post the election, when things have settled down a bit more generally within government. Importantly, between now and then, though, we'll absolutely be looking at ways to really grow that awareness around the ways social enterprises can work with the status quo to protect their mission and therefore enable access to capital through that. That's the main next steps for us. Jane, what have I missed within all of that?
No, you haven't missed anything. I guess the only point to make really is that from my perspective as an independent researcher and as an economic anthropologist, the system, the status quo as it was a couple of months ago versus what it is now, we're in the process of massive change globally. So the mandate to have organizations that look after the planet and look after people whilst making money is changed enormously since since January this year. The implications for that, from my perspective, and I'm speaking not as an Akina, somebody who's worked with Akina here, but just more from my own observation here, that the potential for change here and the potential for the role of social enterprise and making a different version of economy as we head into the recession that's inevitable because of COVID-19, how the opportunity there is extraordinary. So social change is happening. There's sort of the way the night sky has got clearer. Streets have been taken over by pedestrians rather than cars. Carbon emissions are right down. You know, experiencing what that's like is sort of significant. How can organizations reconfigure in order to be part of a change that's, we've got an opportunity to change now. We're going to have to change because of what's happening, but how do we make this an opportunity, I guess, is the big thing from my perspective anyway. But bring it on.
Yeah, really well said. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Jackson and Jane, for that wonderfully comprehensive presentation. I think you covered the significant elements of the report and also the work after it. Thank you so very much. I do have a few questions around that presentation, and we'll touch upon the report a little bit as well. But first, to kick things off, I wanted to understand what was, as part of the methodology, what was the regional mix of participants? And do you think that the regional profile of a social enterprise in New Zealand makes a huge difference to how they experience the market?
I'll speak to that. It does make a difference wherever you happen to be in New Zealand. And we accommodated that up to a point within budgetary requirements. So we did interviews in Christchurch, in Wellington, and here in Auckland. We couldn't go further afield because we didn't have the means to do that. Though we did, well, actually, no, we did. We spoke to Hikarangi Enterprises in Ruatoria. So we were able to do some Zoom interviews, but it was more about the participants were chosen because of their really strong mandate to be very powerful, you know, working across the triple bottom line. And yeah, so we were able to do that, and it does make a difference. But the intent of the report was to move above that and to be able to so I'm just getting a screen. The intent of the report was to move beyond regional differences to create create sort of sameness and create a synthesis that was useful.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would just, I think, reiterate that what really stood out to me was the extent and the real level of the innovation amongst all of the social enterprises we spoke to, regardless of where they were based. There was no hint that you couldn't predict where one was from based on innovation. For example, they were consistently, whether it was from a smaller region or a bigger city, consistently really impressive